I see trees of green.
This is a plantation on a farm in Western Australia where we had this exercise of talking how trees grow and measured a few trees, and I suspect we'll see something similar today. It's got every aspect there, but it's only got one species, but it's got the size of the tree, but I'm interested in how that tree is interacting with the ones around it in a forest. And that dynamics is exactly what happens in a native forest or a plantation or a garden. And you can use the same principles when you go home and look at your pear tree next to a pear tree, next to a cherry tree, and start thinking about how they're interacting. Because a lot of that interaction is actually about light. Now the soils and the rainfall are sort of a given, they're a base, but how the tree behaves in that environment is often to do with light. And so we'll talk about that. Height growth and branch extension. This is elongation. As far as trees growing above the ground, root systems are very similar, but let's just ignore them for a moment. We're talking about access to light. There are 2 points on the tree which are important for growth. So when we're talking about changing the way our trees grow, it will only happen if we change the way the growth occurs either at the top of the tree and the tip of the branches, which is called biologically the apial meristem, but ignore that. The growth at the tips and the growth around the stem. They're the only 2 things that are actually growing in the tree. So when we talk about changing something, how does that growth change at the tip and around the trunk and around the branches? So let's look at that tip growth, or you might call it height growth or elongation of the branches. And essentially it occurs right at the tip. Right at the tip, you get an extra cell division occurring. So what happens? New cells are created up the growing tip, so the tree gets taller or the branches get longer. But it also, what happens is those cells not only get formed, they elongate. That tip might be 10 centimetres in some trees. New cells are elongating, but then they stop elongating. All the height growth is occurring at the top of the tree. Now, if you put a nail in a tree, that nail does not move up. It stays exactly where you put it. If you put a nail in bamboo, that moves up. Bamboo is a grass. The growing tip in bamboo or grass is actually ground level or below ground, and it pushes up. It's formed new cells, but those cells are elongating and moving up. It's been pushed as well as elongating. 2 things happening. In a tree, all the growth is occurring at the tip. So what affects the growth of that tip, ignore that, is the environment around that growing tip. If you want to see that trace up the centre of this teak log, or if you look at any piece of wood that includes the centre, you'll actually see a dot there. That was the trace of cells left over by that height growth. Just the dead cells left as that elongation occurred. They are not wood cells, they are corky cells, and in almost all species, if you're making a nice piece of furniture, you don't want that centre in it. For 2 reasons. First of all, when you oil it, you'll see it's a very different type of wood. It's a cork rather than a wood cell. So it'll look different. It won't take the varnish or the finish as well. It'll look totally different. And also, it will always crack around that centre because you've got a circle of wood around it that's trying to shrink around nothing, and therefore it has to crack like a pizza. Anyway, you can look in most trees and you'll find the trace left over. You might even see a trace going out here into a branch because they all contain that right up the centre. If that was the only growth that occurred, our trees would be 1 cell thick or 2 cells thick going up. But clearly there's other growth occurring, and that is all that growth around the outside that's occurring. What affects height growth is how much water there is coming up, and the nutrients that are obviously driving cell division, and the environment around the growing space. And this is really important. In any environment, there's some things we can irrigate our trees, that will help them grow a bit taller. But there'll be some point, again, maximum, where the tree can't lift up water in that environment. Where are the tallest trees in Australia? Sheltered valleys in Tasmania that can grow a tree 99.6 centimetres tall, which I understand is the tallest one ever measured with eucalypt at the moment.
Metres.
Yeah, it's not quite 100 metres tall.
Centimetres.
Centimetres, yeah. Well, metres, thank you. And so it has to be a really sheltered, well-watered environment with a high humidity and not much drying winds, because a little bit of drying wind, as I said before, will cavitate and you won't get the high growth. So anything you can do. So in any farm, the only way you can change that environment is shelter that growing tip. Plant the trees closer together so they shelter each other. If you can't water, you can't make the soils deeper, all you can do is change that humidity around the growing tip. So often we start, particularly in dry landscapes or exposed hills, we start by growing our trees close together so that they achieve the potential height growth. Now, growing your trees close together for a long time doesn't force them up to the light. That doesn't occur. You'll hear that all the time. No, it just allows them to grow to their potential, but there's still some point where they won't grow any taller. So how to grow your trees taller? A lot of things you can't do, but what you can do is actually shelter them and look after them. You can't change the soil environment. We'll see that by the examples out in the farm. Stem growth, so that's the middle of the trunk. That's what we call the pith, that's left over for height growth. Everything that occurs around that, the growth rings that you see in a tree, are all produced by this layer of cells just below the bark called the cambium, which is producing wood cells on one side and bark cells on the other. It does two different types of jobs. One thin layer of cells. There is no other cell division occurring there. Cells aren't multiplying except for this cambium layer. So anything we do to improve the growth of the cambium is going to lead to more wood, thicker trees. And the only way we can do that is give it access to more carbon, sugars. And they all come from down the trunk from the photosynthesis, or they're stored in the wood from the previous year's growth. So what's happening in our tree? If we take a cross section, we have the centre, which is the pith, which is just that trace of cells left by that height growth. All dead, nothing happening here, but you'll see the old talking cells. Around it we've got all those wood cells, and they can be divided into what we call heartwood and sapwood. Now, sapwood is the water pipe running up the tree. All the water that goes to the trunk, up the trunk, is going through that band of wood that has got hollow cells, so it's always white coloured, and water will just travel up through there. Even in a blackwood, there's a band of white. A red gum has a band of white. That heartwood, the black coloured wood in blackwood or the red gum, is used to be clear or yellow, but it's had the chemicals deposited in the cells when it was retired from being a water pipe and a place to store sugars, and it was they're all dead. Dump the chemicals in there, give it termite protection, give it durability, because that role is just to hold the leaf up there. Now, if you didn't have durable hardwood and you're in termite country, that tree would have been eaten out and it wouldn't be able to be in the canopy, wouldn't have produced seeds, wouldn't have actually survived on that site. So you go to the tougher the country, the more fungus, the more termites, or the more disease you have on the site, what grows there naturally will tend to be durable to that in the hardwood. So you have sandalwood in Western Australia, you have all the durable hardwoods, the red ironbark, the red gum, it's all there just because mountain ash, which is non-durable, even if it could grow here, it wouldn't have survived because it would have rotted out and something else would have outcompeted. The cambium layer is just below the bark. On the outside of that cambium layer, the wood that's laid down by the new bark, in the new bark cells, is actually where the sugars flow down the stem. And I think that's interesting. So what happens, I've just shown you that, so you know what happens when you ring bark a tree. Why does it die?
The pipe system.
Well, if you
Taking away the sugars and the nutrients.
Well, so that's all sapwood there. I cut a little bit deeper with the chainsaw. But say I took the bark off, I've ring barked it, I haven't cut the wood.
Oh.
So I haven't cut the water pipe.
Yeah, okay.
I have cut the sugar pipe. All the sugar coming down. So what happens? The sugars come down the stem, they get to there, they cannot cross that ring barked area, but the water can still go up. So when you ring bark a tree, and I do this on many trees, I might try and... I had to buy a tree in Indonesia so I could do this demonstration. It cost me $10 US. It was the crappiest tree, and the funny thing is I cut it down and they took it straight away. I said I want to buy, because you know, every teak tree is worth a gold, but I bought this at $10 US. So I wanted to demonstrate that what happens when, in that case, cut the whole tree down, but we started by ring barking it. If the sugars flow down, why does the tree die? Because the root system gets starved of sugars. You're interrupting that flow, you're not letting the water go up. And you'll see ringbark trees in our landscape, still from the old days when the Chinese gangs used to go out and ringbark the trees. And I always wonder why they've cut into the wood. Because all the bark's come off, the tree died. They actually cut too deep. And they wasted all that time cutting the wood. All they had to do was cut the bark, which is easy. A cow can do that. And that's what happens. Cows ringbark trees all the time. They're not starting the water to flow, they're stopping the sugars go down. I've had people ring me up and say, I ringbarked my trees 2 years ago and they're not dead. Well, they're getting, the root system staying alive. Where's it getting its sugars from? It's getting it from another tree that it's grafted to. So you can actually have a tree that's surviving even though it's been totally ringbarked, because the root system has been sustained with sugars from another tree, and the water that's being provided to the canopy is still going up. When you ringbark a tree, the canopy carries on. It doesn't know it. It's goes ahead, it's using the water, it's sending sugars down. As long as the water's coming up, it's fine. What you tend to find is about the second summer, it all just drops dead. Because it's suddenly, the root system's dead. And suddenly it's the first it knows of the problem. If you think trees have a voice and understand what's going on. Live stumps, I talked about these before. Cut this tree down, this is still growing in diameter. The centre wood is all rotten out, but the tree still grows. That's because without leaf, it's getting all its sugars from the other trees. So I like to see, rather than that tree's caring for the stump, those trees commandeered this root system when I cut the tree down. The water, rather than going up this stem, just went up that stem over there. So that's how you can see live stumps in the landscape without leaves. Stem growth, how much diameter we get, is all based on how much sugars flow down the stem. The bigger, the healthier, the more sunlight hitting that leaf, the more photosynthesis, the more sugars flow down, the more wood and incidentally bark you get on the tree, the more diameter growth you actually get as a result of that. Now I'm going to show you a couple of examples before we start moving on, but I hope this illustrates how trees grow, but also our opportunity to make a difference to a forest. I'm going to use this plantation where I ran this exercise, today's exercise, up in Darwin in a teak forest. The trees were 13 years old, small patch of teak at the back of the farm, and we're in this forest and I'm thinking, I want to cut a tree down. And I went to the owner and said, we'll cut a tree down. And I convinced him, I didn't have to pay him $10 million to do it. So I got him to cut it right off at the base. And I got this sample out of the tree, right? And I knew teak in Darwin is deciduous. So it only grows in the wet season and it stops growing in the dry season. So I thought I could count the growth rings and one growth ring per year. So if that was the case, there would be 13 growth rings. Right in the centre, now teak is a Southeast Asian species, really high value. Did a lot of work with teak growers in Indonesia, lovely species, because it responds to management. And if I can get farmers to do it, they'll get a really good response. And I'll show you why. Right in the centre, the corky material. It's not teak wood, it's cork. So again, it's not, you don't want it in nice teak carvings. Then you've got the heartwood around there. And you can see that the heartwood is irregular, it does not follow a growth ring. It is really just some cells that were retired from being a water pipe. Chemicals have been dumped in there, that gives it colour and durability that makes teak so valuable. We have the sapwood, the water pipe, around there. And we have the cambium, which you can't even see, but we know where it is. And we've got the bark on the outside. Then we've got the growth rings. I've just drawn them in, the growth rings, and there should be 13 or so there. So what do you notice about the growth rings? They're getting closer and closer together. As soon as I walked into this forest, I could say, I need to show them that these trees are slowing down to virtually nothing. They're growing millimetres per year. I can see them, their canopies, crowded out, sick-looking things. Okay? If I'm going to try and convince them that if they thin it, take half the trees out, beautiful straight trees, they would have more growth on the retained trees. I first had to convince them that it was competition that was slowing the trees down. Just access to light. So you can see that that's first year, and then there was a really good year. Next year was really bad, maybe the rains came late or something. You'd expect some variability, particularly in the early years, based on seasons. But then I think you can see that irrespective of seasons, unless they got progressively worse and worse and worse, there was a general decline in growth rate over the last 5 or 6 years. So I put that on the graph. It grew really well in the first few years, and then progressively it got less and less. Increment per year went from 2 centimetres per year in diameter down to a few millimetres per year in diameter.
Different species would have optimum.
That's
size
true,
of the
but I just want to point out I've used a species that none of you know anything about, presumably, to show you that this applies to every species of tree around the world. There is some point at which competition starts limiting sugar supply down the stem and therefore growth rate in healthy trees. There are other things that slow growth down, but we're just talking about healthy trees being impacted by crowding in some fashion. So we've got that. Who can read that? I still haven't found anyone in Australia who can read that. Great thing about you working at the uni, I get to go places that, as a professional forester, no one else goes there. This is the teak research station in northern Thailand near Chiang Mai. And you can imagine I'm in my element there, talking with people who study the growth of teak and how the options to manage it. They had these 2 samples that show everything I wanted to show to farmers. Which tree is growing faster? How can you tell? Because I've drawn the growth rings here. If I didn't show you the growth rings, is there something else to show you that is growing faster, other than just the size of the log?
Yeah, the writing at the top.
Yeah. The width of the sapwood. A wider sapwood band is a bigger water pipe. A tree has a bigger water pipe if it's got a bigger canopy. A bigger canopy means more sugars flowing down. So you've got this sort of thing. A tree doesn't retire that sapwood if it needs it for growth. It only retires it when it's got a large enough water pipe. We don't understand how it all triggers that, but every case you look at, the bigger the canopy, the greater the volume of that, the cross-sectional area of that water pipe.
So you go back to that first graph, which showed it slow, that one there. Ideally, what would you be doing? Should you be thinning between 4 or 5 years, or should you be...
Well, my view is we're talking about trees that are only this big.
Yeah.
So no one there in that group could convince me that they were slowing down because they were old and big.
Yeah.
Okay? So my view is if I could convince them competition was a factor, there's no reason why that graph couldn't be going up like that.
Yeah.
The same growth rate per year.
But to get...
How do I do that?
Yes.
Obviously work out timely, take it out before the competition occurs, before it slows down. How do I get you to do that? Measure your trees, write the diameter on it, come back. If it's grown less, you could say, is it a drought year? Maybe. Measure it again, it's growing a bit slower. Oh, maybe it's competition. Measure it again, oh, it's really competition. I had trees that I was measuring every year that were growing at 4 centimetres per year, and it dropped down to 1.5, and I said, okay, they're too close, I've got to cut them out.
But don't you then have also the issue that the other parameters, your environment and storm activity, if you do that thinning too quickly, and you end up with a massive storm?
Yep. That's playing the risk game. So how do I reduce the risk? How many do I think? That one is 63 years old. Grown by foresters on a teak research station. 63 years to produce a log that big. It's about this big. This one, guess the age.
It's less than 63.
25 years.
Wow. 25. Because it was...
I can go back to this graph here 2 centimetres growth per year. Could have been maintained 2 centimetres growth per year if the competition was controlled. That tree at age 10 would have been 20 centimetres in diameter, not 12. We can make it grow 6, 8, 10 times faster in a year if we eliminate the competition that it would have otherwise been under. A tree growing in an open garden, you know, the oak trees are fatter in a big wide space garden than they are in an oak forest. It's a huge difference in growth per year that you can get. Why are we cutting down trees that are almost a metre in diameter at 33 years? Because I've controlled the competition. It's so dramatic. Now, if you're a government forester and you're being paid a salary, do you care if it takes 63 years to grow your teak?
Lifetime opportunity.
If you're a farmer in Thailand who's put a hectare of trees under teak, are you thinking, is there any value? I get slightly less volume, but I can get big logs ready for market in half the time, a third of the time? That's huge. You get less volume because you've opened up your forest to a parkland rather than a crowded plantation. Do you care if you get less volume if you produce the value that much earlier? Do you care if you've got 1,000 trees spread over 5 hectares rather than put on 1 hectare? Pulpwood plantations of eucalypts have 1,000 trees per hectare. I have 1,000 trees. I spread them over 20 hectares. You know, 50, 60 eucalypts per hectare. Now, I'm not fully utilising all the soil and light and water for wood growth, but I've got understory, I've got grazing, I've got other species growing there. I can utilise the waste. But if you're just interested in the timber, if you're a company that's bought the land and you only want to produce timber, if you're Hancock's and you lease land and the only product you're allowed to produce off that is wood, volume is important per hectare. I say for most of us, yield per hectare is well down the list compared to return on the time that I spent in the forest. The values that I get from the forest, those 4 categories we looked at last week. So as we go around today, and when you visit my place, I want to show that you can use the same science to create a very different forest, and you may be able to do it very, very much quicker. Old plantation of teak in southern India. They have a teak museum there, and they have got a picture on the wall about that big of an English forester being carried across a creek by a local Indian.
Oh.
The colonial days were wonderful. And that's when they planted these. They had lots of labour, and they had the English teak forest. And you can see this forest was planted pretty close together. It's been thinned and probably pruned over that period of time. And they've reduced the stocking rate down. And they've got some beautiful logs there at 70 years old. They might have been able to do a bit quicker. But this is nothing new. It's not new genetics, it's not new fertilisers. This is inherent basic forestry that's been used for hundreds of years, possibly much longer. But the earliest applications appear to be in oak in Germany, where they thinned the oak forest, particularly because they needed to produce fast-growing oak for battleships of a large size. And the faster you grow oak, the denser the wood is. We'll talk about that on my place. And they knew that. So this is, I love this because this is old. This is not new science. It's just what we lost during the industrial forestry era, where everyone managing a forest ended up in an office, not that German forester who passed on the knowledge to their child who looked after that forest over generations. What are we going to be more like? I think we're going to be more like that, about having a particular patch of forest that we're caring and monitoring over time, not just a team in an office a long way away is only interested in an outcome.
Rowan, can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Sorry. Just with the growth rings, I've heard talk over the years about, a plantation tree might not be as strong as an old growth tree. Where those growth rings, you say in 63 years, would that tree, would that tree be stronger or have better qualities than the 25-year-old tree?
These are 2 samples of shining gum, one from our place. The growth rings are over 1 centimetre apart. The other comes from the same size tree log in the native forest, which was over 60 years old in Victoria. And you look at the end, the growth rings in the native forest ones are millimetres apart, mine are 10 centimetres apart. Now, quality. What is quality? If I'm making a musical instrument, it might be important how far those growth rings are on a spruce on the backboard of a spruce guitar. If I'm using it for a carving of teak, no impact. There is one market, I've asked that question. What market for teak, for example, where the growth ring distance matters? The rails on very expensive sailing ships, the handrails. Because those handrails are in the weather all the time. And the weather beating actually eats out the low density wood between the growth rings, and you get a little bit of a wave in it. So those $1 million yachts where someone wants a teak handrail, that's the market. So I'm not saying there's no market for slow growth, there is. But it all depends. Now, those two, the market, I've always said to myself, what if it happens if I use my shining gun for flooring and my daughter wears high heels? She can actually, there's a distance between those growth rings where she can actually put her high heel in and dip that.
Yeah.
So that would be a problem. Same with the pine flooring, for example. Because there is low density between the growth rings. Overall density, there's some other issues going on, but growth rate per se does not affect overall density of eucalypts. In pines and red cedar, it makes it stronger.
Yep.
No, sorry, in oak and red cedar, it makes it stronger. I haven't found a species, given the same size, same age of the trees, that grow them faster in the next year, they will be reducing the overall wood density. So I'm still waiting for someone to show me that. And that's what they found with the teak. They actually found, they were very worried about colour. And say, well, colour, teak is sold by colour. It's about teak. It's got to look like teak.
Yeah.
So they're concerned, and they showed me lots of samples. And the reason they compared these two is because they had about the same width of heartwood. You need a bigger tree, but it produced the same amount of heartwood in it, despite the fact that it was much younger. Okay. Plant lots of trees because you want to shelter them from exposure. So the more exposed your site, the more sheltering them when they're young is going to improve their height growth. If you plant one tree out on site in the middle of a paddock on a windy north-facing slope, it's going to grow like an apple tree. Because every growing tip, like down the beach, you've all seen the effect of the salt wind on your trees. They grow away because the only thing that grows is what's sheltered from the salt wind. It's the same. If you protect the growing tip, you'll get a straighter, healthier, taller tree up to a point. So plant them close together, as close as you need to. Now our farm's pretty sheltered now. I don't worry about that. I plant them where I want a tree. Shelter doesn't matter. But most of us are starting with open paddocks. Then, when does the competition kick in for that species? How can you read it, measure it, understand what's going on? And should you thin? Now you don't have to thin, but you should know what you're losing if you don't. If you don't thin, you're losing growth. You're losing healthy trees as well. They'll get impacted more come a drought or when the disease comes. Then they'll grow larger, and as they get larger, they start competing again because they've got bigger canopies. And the bigger canopy needs more space per tree, so they're starting to shade each other. Maybe you need to thin again. Or you accept slower growth and say, oh, I'll wait 10 years unless I get something out of it. Now, that is a view that most people take, and it's a reason why we don't have many big trees on farms, because everyone's waiting for their trees to at least be big enough to be used for something. And while they're waiting, they're missing out on that 10-fold increase in growth rate. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince them about that. Then you get this. And then you can grow that. Because you're giving the tree space to actually grow. And stuff like that. A couple of examples to illustrate that those principles that I argue apply to all tree species do occur in Australia. You have to find a tree that's got growth rings in it, if you're going to use this way of illustrating the point. All I have to tell you, that is a pine tree harvested in Tasmania. What can you tell me about the history of that pine tree? If it's in Tasmania, because it gets cold, we pretty much know that every one of those growth rings is 1 year's growth. Okay? Planted there, grew pretty well, but then progressively slowed down to the point that millimetres per year of diameter growth. You go in with your tape measure, 1 year, come back a year later, it's grown 2 millimetres. You say, wait a minute, it's 30 centimetres of diameter, it's only 20 years old. It used to do more than a centimetre, now it's only doing a millimetre. People have tried to tell me, oh, because the tree's bigger, it can't put as much growth on a bigger... No. The canopy has to get bigger so you can grow more wood to make up for that. What happened then? They thinned the forest. Now, as I was saying with those I didn't have this example in Darwin. Can I convince those people that if they did it, a year or two later, the trees had left, we have more leaf, more water, more growth, maybe the benefit of the root system next door, but in response they would produce more sugars, flow down the stem, you get more growth. Look at that. It is something like it was when the tree was 5 years old. You could say, you could count 10 or 12 growth rings there and say they lost 10 or 12 times over a centimetre. They lost heaps of wood that they could have had because they didn't thin there and they waited to there. When you cut that tree open, is that a good piece of wood that's got wide growth rings and narrow growth rings close together? Probably not. It wouldn't matter for pine scantling, but it might look a bit silly on a tabletop or something. You can maintain even diameter growth if you maintain even competition, given that the site is suitable for that species. You can get big trees. I've got no problem if people act on knowledge and they say, well, I know it would be better if I did that. Do they really know how different it would be? And they've made a judgment. That's your decision. I'm not managing your trees. I'm showing you what happens if you do. And you choose to say, I want a crowded forest. I like that feeling of being in a dense, crowded forest, and I want more volume, and I don't care about that. But just know you may be waiting 100 years compared to what some of us are doing. Despite the lowering rainfall, we're achieving the same thing in 30 years. If people understand the cost of that decision, I think they're more likely to act and stuff, as long as they didn't plant too many. And in all the stuff I've written, I've talked about these principles that I've talked about here are exactly the same in native forest. In fact, I spend as much time measuring trees in a native forest than I do in a plantation. Because if you walk into a native forest, pick out a really good tree, measure its diameter, oh, beautiful tree, 60, 70 centimetres in diameter. Then look around and say, how close are the other big trees in that forest? You will find that in a natural forest that's never been touched by people, it'll be 12, 15 metres before you see another big tree. The trees that used to be between those two big ones have died naturally. The forest has killed the trees. 90% of the trees that come up in a forest after a wildfire in the ash forest, 99% of them won't be there in 250 years' time when that is an old growth forest. No one cut them down, they just died because they were the weaker ones in that competition for light. The problem is, the fact they hung on until they couldn't hang on anymore meant that they were stealing light for years and years from their neighbours. We have the opportunity, because we have the ability and the knowledge to predict what might happen, to get in there and do it before the competition becomes severe. And if people know that, they'll know more about that option.
So what do you say to landcare groups? Should they actually go in and have a good look at their landcare?
I reckon they should have a very good look at themselves.
And
What they say.
during
I think if your motive is conservation and your goal is to have trees that are 60 centimetres large, even with hollows in them, don't just sit there and wait, because the trees won't grow in diameter and the hollows will not form, because to get a hollow you need a rapidly growing tree that has a large enough branch and that branch to die. So thin around a tree that's got potential for a hollow, identify a branch of the right diameter, right height on the right side of the tree. Ask the experts, what do you need for a sugar glider? 6 centimetre hollow, pick a 6 centimetre branch. Which side of the tree do you want it? East side's more sheltered. How high above the foxes do you want it? At least 3 metres. Okay, identify that branch, ring bark that branch so it dies, and leave the branch stub there so the tree grows over it rapidly, so thin around it so it grows rapidly in diameter. That branch will rot back into the stem. Help it along if you want to drill some holes, but as long as it's dying, it'll rot back in the stem. You'll end up with a hollow perfectly into that tree of that diameter that you want. And you'll get it, I've seen it occur in the time I've owned the farm just by mistletoe killing trees on widely spaced healthy trees. It's not going to happen if you lock a forest up, because those trees do not form hollows. They have small branches, they're not even growing in diameter, you won't get it. So the science can be used for whatever you want to use it for, and that's why I'm so excited about this course, because I hope we're not giving you answers, we're giving you ideas so you can achieve the answers that you actually want. I'm not even going to talk about pruning now, because I just want to emphasise that thinning, because I used to think pruning was more important than thinning. Pruning is just a tool that gives you a return from thinning. Because if I go and prune, if I've got trees growing close together, it's like hollow formation. I've got twice the amount of pruning work, but the trees aren't growing quickly, so I get much less back for that pruning work. And it occurred to me, I'd prune a tree, I'd come down the tree, I'd walk 3 metres, and I'd climb another tree, and I'd look back and think, bugger, if I'd walked 6 metres and pruned that tree, those trees would have been further apart, they both would have been healthier, and they would have grown 3, 4, 5 times faster than the one in between. So people say, well, I'm going to wait for this one to get big enough to sell. No, I cut it down and let it rot. We've stagnated our forests because we're all worried about getting money for nothing. Ask yourself, would you buy a 5-year-old eucalyptus for firewood, or what would you do with it? It's not worth anything. But a 50 centimetre one might be. It's just, I love the fact that as an academic I've been able to work in my own trees and I start to see things differently to the computer models that other people are reading. And they keep arguing that point. No, you've got to have 250 or 500 pine trees per hectare. And I say, well, have you ever managed them? You know how much work that is? John Woodley will charge you twice as much to prune that than if you have half the number of trees, as long as there's enough for them to shelter each other and they're healthy trees.
I think to myself, what a wonderful